It's only January 8th, but we'll start planting for spring in less than 6 weeks. So now is a great time to begin planning for a spring garden. Today I'll share a complete garden layout for both our front yard and backyard gardens. I'll let you know what, when, and where we're planting, as well as share my thoughts on plant selection, location, and spacing. My hope is that this video will help you with your garden planning, as well as give you a better idea of how to get an early start on the growing season, and how to make the most out of your limited growing space. Though I usually plan my garden layout with pencil and paper, this year I decided to use garden planning software to make it easier for me to share my plans with you. Though I think pencil and paper work just fine for most people, if you're interested in the software, I've provided a link to it in the description. Let's start our review of the garden layout here in the backyard garden, which is 23 feet wide and 55 feet long. I'll start on the north side, where the hoop house is located, and work my way south to where we're growing perennials like grapes, raspberries, and blackberries. The hoop house bed is a polyculture of perennials and self-sown annuals, plus a small number of intentionally planted annuals. Though the software I'm using works great for traditional row planting and square foot gardening, it doesn't accurately capture the look of a densely planted polyculture. We probably won't plant anything in this bed for spring for 3 reasons. First, most of the plants already growing there will survive the winter and really take off in late winter and early spring. Second, the bed is full of perennials like Egyptian walking onions, bunching onions, tree collards, chives, lovage, and sorrel, and those plants will need room to grow in the spring. And third, because we let plants drop their seeds in the bed, new volunteers will come up on their own without having to be planted. Though we probably won't plant anything inside the hoop house, we will plant Triunfo Violetto pole beans on the outside of the bed to grow up 3 of the hoops. These beans did remarkably well last year, and we'll be planting them in a variety of locations around the garden this year. A couple weeks after our last frost, we'll plant 4 seeds at the bottom of each hoop and train the plants up the hoops. The greenhouse plastic will be removed from the top of the hoop house in April, leaving the bare hoops as an excellent structure for vertical crops. Though we grew the same beans here last year, I'm not concerned that I'm not rotating in another crop. Crop rotation is a remedy to pest, disease, and nutrient deficiency issues that are most prevalent in monocultures. However, in my experience, these problems are far less common in polycultures of diverse, unrelated crops. Since these problems don't exist, we don't need the remedy provided by crop rotation. Let's now move south of the hoop house to this area, where we'll start planting in mid-February. Though we'll grow a lot of food in this area, we won't have to plant very much because once again, most of the plants are perennials or self-sown annuals. On the west side of the garden, we're growing 3 perennials: sunchokes, blueberries, and strawberries. On the east side, there's a peach tree and 4 perennial vegetables: French sorrel, Good King Henry, sea kale, and Sylvetta arugula. Self-sown Claytonia and Mosh are growing between the sea kale plants. In addition, this red kitten spinach is part of our winter garden and will easily continue through the spring. That leaves just a little bit of room to plant annual crops. In mid-February, 9 to 10 weeks before our last frost of April 27th, I'll plant carrots and lettuce in this bed, which is protected by a double-layered low tunnel. I'll plant 16 Danvers half-long carrots per square foot and transplant winter red lettuce started 6 weeks earlier indoors, wherever I can find space between spinach plants. I'll finish planting the bed in late February or early March, when I plant French breakfast and white icicle radishes here. I'll use the square foot garden spacing of 16 radishes per square foot. Finally, in mid-March, about 6 weeks before our last frost, I'll add soil to the top of this compost bin and plant red Norrland potatoes under a single layer of plastic. Red Norlands are an early season variety. I'll plant them 8 inches apart and harvest them when they're fairly small for our earliest potato harvest of the season. Moving further to the south, we come to the beds where we grow most of our summer annual crops. We planted garlic and elephant garlic in this part of the garden last October. We're growing music garlic here, California softneck garlic from the grocery store in these locations, and elephant garlic here. The garlic is spaced about 4 inches apart, and the elephant garlic is about 8 inches apart. In mid to late February, I'll plant 8 sugar snap peas per square foot along the north side of this bed. This very early planting day is made possible by the double-layered low tunnel protecting the bed. I'll plant the northernmost beds first because beds to the south will still be in the shade at this time of year. When the low tunnel is removed in April, I'll install a trellis for the peas to climb. As a rule, I grow vertical crops on the north side of beds in order to avoid shading other crops in the bed. However, I don't have to worry about the peas shading the strawberries and blueberries behind them, because the peas won't be very tall until close to the summer solstice. By then the sun will be very high in the sky, and the shadow cast by the peas won't reach the berries. The rest of the plants in this bed, including carrots, chard, kale, lettuce, mosh, and spinach, are part of our winter garden. These plants should all survive through spring under the double-layered low tunnel, but if we lose some of the more vulnerable chard and lettuce plants, I'll replace them in mid to late February with greens started in the grow room. In mid-March, I'll plant more sugar snap peas on the north side of this bed, which will be protected by a single layer of 6mm plastic. I'll plant purple Viking potatoes in the rest of the bed at the same time, spacing them about 8 to 10 inches apart. The purple Viking should be ready to harvest at about the same time the peas are done producing. I'll install a trellis for the peas to climb after removing the plastic in April. The next round of planting in this area will take place in early April, a few weeks before our last frost in unprotected areas. I will practice crop rotation in these beds because they're not as close to true polyculture beds as the bed in the hoop house. I'll plant Yukon Gold potatoes here, spacing them about 8 to 10 inches apart. All of the beets, carrots, chard, lettuce, pak choi, spinach, and turnips will be planted in early April using square-foot garden spacing. I'll also transplant dinosaur kale that was started in the grow room 6 weeks earlier, as well as tree collards that were overwintered in the grow room. As you can see, I don't plant all of a particular crop in a single bed. Instead, I plant in a variety of locations around the garden next to unrelated crops. This practice makes it more difficult for pests to locate their desired crops and for diseases to take hold. In mid-April, a couple weeks before our last frost, I'll start cucumbers and cushaw, acorn, butternut, zucchini, and patty pan squash under cover. I'll move the double-layered low tunnel from this bed to this one to protect the zucchini, and I'll cover the rest of the squash and cucumbers with cold frames. The covers will be removed 2 to 3 weeks after the last frost. When the cucumbers and winter squash plants are tall enough, I'll install trellises to support them. All of these plants take up a great deal of space when allowed to sprawl out in the garden, but growing them vertically dramatically reduces the square footage they require. Finally, after the last frost, I'll transplant celery that was started 10 weeks earlier in the grow room. And in mid-May, I'll transplant tomatoes that were started indoors in mid-March. Once again, we'll use square-foot garden spacing of 1 plant per square foot for celery and tomatoes. We grow only indeterminate tomatoes, prune them to a single stem by removing suckers, and grow them vertically to save space in the garden. Just to the east of our summer annual beds, we have our Asian pear tree and this long, narrow bed along the fence. We're growing honeyberries here, and we'll also plant some more perennials here in the spring, along with some annuals. After this spring's planting, this bed will consist mostly of edible perennials. In addition to the honeyberries, we're already growing lovage and French sorrel, and we'll plant 2 gooseberries and 2 raspberries this spring. In the understory of the perennials, I'll plant lettuce and spinach in early April, and I'll transplant tomatoes in mid-May along the edge of the bed. These tomatoes will be pruned to a single stem and grown up conduit stakes. To make the most of the growing space, I'll also grow 2 pole beans up each stake. The pole beans will be a combination of Triunfo Violetto and Kentucky pole beans. To finish our overview of the backyard garden, let's move to the southmost part of the yard, where we're growing mostly perennials, with some annuals squeezed in here and there. Here we're growing raspberries, grapes, strawberries, asparagus, and blackberries. We're also going to squeeze in containers of beets, carrots, and turnips that will be planted in early April. And we'll grow single-stem tomatoes and pole beans up conduit stakes in nooks and crannies where we can squeeze them in. Now let's take a look at the front yard garden, where we grow mostly ornamentals, but have been adding more and more edibles every year. The front yard garden is 23 by 25 feet. We've grown oregano, chives, and sage in the ground for years, And every summer we grow basil, eggplants, and peppers in 7 and 10-gallon grow bags. These 3 crops are all started in the grow room in mid-March, about 6 weeks before our last frost date, and transplanted into their containers in mid-May. We'll expand the front yard garden this year by planting scarlet runner beans in mid-May in a 10-gallon smart pot. The beans will grow vertically up a trellis. We'll also expand the garden by growing in 3 3-foot diameter fire rings that we're using as raised beds. We'll plant a sugar baby watermelon in a cold frame here in late April and remove the cold frame in mid to late May. We'll start leeks and onions in the grow room in mid-February and transplant them here in early April. And finally, we'll start sweet potatoes under cover in late April and remove the cover in mid to late May. These changes should double the production of our front yard garden. I hope this video gave you a better idea of how we plan our spring garden so that we can get off to an early start and make the most of our limited growing space. As a follow-up, in my next video, I'll share a complete spring planting schedule, which starts in mid-February. I'll also share a planting tool that you can use in your garden to schedule your plantings of a wide variety of crops based on your last frost date. For a closer look at our garden layouts, please see the links in the description. There's also a link to our spring planting schedule if you'd like to take a look at it before my next video. In addition to sharing our complete garden layout and planting schedule, starting in mid-February, I'll bring you videos showing you step by step how I turn this plan into a reality. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos on how to grow a lot of food on a little land without spending much or working harder than you have to.